Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, the podcast where we have casual conversations offering up insider knowledge on the most important events in the broader Middle East and why it matters to America today. I'm Brian Katoulis. I'm host of the podcast and senior fellow here, and we're in the beautiful Oman library here at the Middle East Institute. Taking the Edge Off the Middle East loosens things up a bit and brings some new life and energy to conversations about the Middle East and U.S. policy towards the region. Oftentimes, our conversations are lighthearted and seek to humanize the challenges and opportunities of the Middle East with good humor and fun, but we don't stray far away from the difficult and complicated realities of the region. And this particular episode we're going to have this week, my guest is my friend Amir Tibon, who's a journalist at Haaretz, which is a leading newspaper in Israel, and author of the 2024 book, The Gates of Gaza. Amir and his wife Mary and their two young daughters were living in kibbutz Nahal Oz, an Israeli community less than a mile from Gaza City when Hamas attacked on October 7th, 2023. His book, The Gates of Gaza, is the story of their ordeal, but it's a brilliant book that actually depicts very succinctly the story of Israel and its relationships with Palestinians and its neighbors over the last several decades, back to the founding of the nation state. The core of his story is how his young family, narrowly escaped the attack with the help of his father and others. But what we do in this conversation is carry that particular ordeal to the current moment and talk about the current status of affairs in Israel today, its relationship with the wider world, and how America is talking about Israel. So I hope you enjoy the episode. Amir Tibon, welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East. Let's take some edge off the Middle East.
Yeah, good to see you, Brian.
It's really nice to see you. Yeah, we're here in the beautiful Oman library here on the campus of the Middle East Institute. And I have to say, I just want to start with the personal, because this is what I've been doing. You and I have not seen each other for almost 3.5, almost 4 years, right?
I think the last time we met was in Tel Aviv in 2022. It was a different world back then. And you came to visit, and you actually came to the Haaretz office in South Tel Aviv.
And we had, with Esther,
yes,
Solomon, we had falafel, right?
We went to eat falafel. It was great.
Yeah.
It was fun.
Yeah, so I had just come because I was actually going to spend the day. I don't know if you remember this. I got permission from the Israeli authorities and then the authorities in Gaza at the time to go into Gaza. And I actually was staying in Mitzpe Ramon the night before, a place that is beautiful.
Southern Israel in the desert.
Yeah. And by the way, Southern Israel, rumor has it that you know all of the great spots to go dining. You're like a foodie, right?
That's pretty true, at least in that part of the country.
Yeah. No, you should write a guide. Maybe that's your next book after the book that we're going to talk about.
Well, if we do a podcast episode about it, I'm willing to do another book, yes.
Yeah, so I was supposed to go in, and I got tipped off the night before from two of my dear friends saying, well, the organization that's sponsoring you may get some problems with the authorities that are governing Gaza right now. They probably won't keep you very long, but it won't be as smooth of a trip. So instead of going to Gaza, I had lunch with you.
I hope we were worthy compensation for that.
Yeah, we met in the 2010s, though, initially. You were living in D.C.?
I was in D.C. for a while for Haaretz.
Yeah.
As the correspondent here.
Yeah.
And those were interesting times as well.
Yeah.
But I think when we met in Israel, in Tel Aviv, that was really probably the last kind of, month of sanity. It was right before the election of that year in Israel.
Yeah.
Which brought the current Netanyahu government to power.
Right.
I would say perhaps a year and change before October 7. And, I think back on the mood and the atmosphere back then, there was even a sense of optimism. I remember he spoke about, where things were going, what could happen. Well, it didn't go in the direction we anticipated.
No, not at all. And I remember we're going to talk about Israeli politics now on the back end and where things are. But I remember then in the run up to it, I was asking you questions about, and I don't speak Hebrew very well, I speak Arabic, but there are these concepts of mamlachti. I think that's what people are saying. And this sort of
statism, you can call it.
Yeah. But the idea, I think, if I got it, was unifying together for the cause of the state, sort of like patriotism, but not exactly. Is that right?
I think it's there is an element of patriotism, but it's one of those words in Hebrew that cannot be translated into English.
Yeah.
By the way, this is a fascinating subject, like words in languages that don't have an equivalent in other. Yeah. There's Hebrew and Arabic examples of this, English and Hebrew. So mamlachtiyut, which is this very important value in the Israeli national identity, I would say it's loyalty to the state above your own politics or above your own even ideology.
Right.
And this idea that there has to be some set of rules that is agreed upon everyone, from the right, from the left, in between. And this foundational value is really under attack.
It's under stress, and we're going to talk about that. But that was then, this is now, and 3.5 years, 4.5 years sometimes can feel like a lifetime. And we're going to talk about your book, The Gates of Gaza. If you've not read it yet, it was out in 2024, but it's still, I think, very relevant today. And it's the story of you and your wife, Miri, your two little daughters, Galia and Carmel, right?
Like a mountain.
Yeah, like Carmel. Let's start first before October 7th. You and your family, you and your wife decided to move to Nahal Oz, kibbutz Nahal Oz in 2014. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Tell us first why. What's a kibbutz? Is it a settlement? Like, just break it down for us for ordinary Americans who are kind of dumb like me.
So a kibbutz is a unique Israeli invention. It's a small community, something between a small town and a village, which is based on socialist communal values. And the kibbutzim have a very important role in Israeli history. They were actually mostly established before Israel existed as a country, and they kind of paved the way to the creation of the country because they basically took over lands, started creating agriculture and life. And there is this old saying in Israel that if you turn off the lights of the entire country and you only left the lights of the kibbutzim, you would see the original borders of the state of Israel.
Oh,
the pre-1967 borders, before Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza. But you would kind of see the Israel-Lebanon border, which is dotted with these small communities, the Israel-Gaza border, which is, around it you have 20 of these kibbutzim. And I'm happy you raised the question of kibbutzim versus settlements because there is an ideological break that divides the two. But there's also just a geographical fact of life. The kibbutzim are mostly spread along the old borders of Israel, the original borders of the state, 1948, whereas the settlements that we discuss in the West Bank, and there used to be in Gaza until Israel left Gaza in 2005. And now there are people that want to rebuild settlements there, but those are located beyond the borders of Israel.
Right.
And I think the basic dispute is that the kibbutz movement wanted to create borders for the state of Israel out of an understanding that a country needs borders. There has to be a definition of where the country begins and ends. And so the kibbutzim were built in order to mark and then protect the borders of the state of Israel. The settlements in the West Bank today are trying to erase the old border or expand the border and move Israel to take over other lands where you have today millions of Palestinians living.
Right.
So that's a big ideological difference between the two.
Right. And you describe also in your book, if I recall properly, is that the kibbutzim were different than military bases in that the whole ethos, the idea that you're bringing people together in a community and connecting them together and with the land and doing it in a way that it was a new, different type of sort of trying to connect with the land of Israel that wasn't just about defense, but defending yourself in terms of we are here, we're people, we can be neighbors. And your book talks about sort of different episodes when Gazans actually came in, right, for different festivals and things like this.
So, it's important for me to talk about all of these things honestly, because many of the kibbutzim were founded on what used to be Palestinian lands, and some of them on villages that were destroyed in the 1948 war. It's a complicated history. Specifically, kibbutz Nahal Oz, which became my home, and we'll talk in a minute about how I came to live there. It was founded in 1953, so after Israel had been created, and it did not sit on lands that were beforehand a Palestinian village or anything like that. It's a kibbutz that was built on the border with a clear aim of protecting the border. And I think if you try to enter the mindset of Israel in the 1950s, it's a very young country. It's literally surrounded by enemies, right? Today, Israel has peace agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, with some more faraway countries, United Arab Emirates, Morocco. But go back to the 1950s, every country in the region is basically an enemy of Israel, at least officially. And most of these countries believe that Israel is a temporary entity that will go away. And specifically in Gaza at the time, and I write about this in the historical chapters of the book, you have I think, more than 200,000 Palestinian refugees
Uh-huh.
who had lost their homes in the 1948 war, what we Israelis call the War of Independence, and they call the Nakba, their destruction, their catastrophe.
That's right. Yeah.
And they believe that Israel is about to be washed over and they will go back.
Right.
And so Ben Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben Gurion, he has this national security philosophy, you can call it, that emphasizes the importance of communities along the border as a way of sending a message to the Arab countries around. We are here to stay.
Yeah.
And we are open to making peace with you, and we don't want to expand territorially beyond the existing borders. Now, of course, there were people in Israel already back then who did want to expand, who did want to take over more land. But most of the people in the kibbutzim along the border, that was not their mission.
Uh-huh.
Their mission was to say, we are here,
Yeah.
we're holding on to this land, we're not going anywhere, get used to it. And we are also extending a hand for peace, and we want to live in peace with you if it's possible.
Yeah, and one more thing about the Gates of Gaza, again, pick up a copy, is it's not just the tale of your ordeal. And I was telling some of my colleagues, you weave together this history of Israel and its modern history and its relationship with its neighbors, and you do it in such a way that if anyone who's teaching an undergraduate class out there and wants an accessible but very smart and informative, detailed history, it's in there. And it's an amazing thing that you did.
Right.
Well, structure.
Yeah, can you take over PR? Well, I'll connect you to Little Brown and Company.
Yeah.
No,
You can help me with PR. I need a lot of help with PR.
but I'll say one thing about this. When I started writing the book, I wrote it in English from the beginning.
Uh-huh.
This is not a translated book. I wrote it in English with a clear intention of telling the story to the world.
Right, and you do a great job doing that. So tell your story about how you came to Nahal Oz. Sorry, I cut you off.
One sentence about. So when, because I began writing it in English, I understood very early on that if I did not include the historical perspective, people wouldn't understand the story.
Right. There you
People
go.
would ask, why would someone go and live there? Why would there be a kibbutz there? And why do these Israelis and Palestinians hate each other? Why are they killing each other? What's the story there? And that's when I realized that in order to tell my story of October 7, I actually have to go back and tell the historical background and tell it in an interesting way so that people won't skip those chapters.
I'm so glad you said that because, I was cutting you off there, but I recall going on a visit to Israel in 2015. I didn't know you lived down there, but I went on one of these delegations. I won't name the person that I was with because this person is near and dear to my heart, but went on to work at the White House and other places. We went. I think it was your kibbutz is the one next one over. And this person was asking the residents,
why would you live here? What brought you here? Yeah,
it's
a legitimate question.
Do you describe it in terms of your identity as a Jew? And we're going to get into Zionism, and you're a liberal Zionist, right? Like, is that fair to say?
Probably word
good.
attack.
We're going to talk about that because that has become a very controversial debate.
I know.
We'll get to that in a second, but we got to talk about your deal. I mentioned I haven't seen you 3.5 years. Can seem like a century. Sometimes 10 hours can feel like a lifetime.
Yeah.
And it was more or less 10 hours, 6:30 in the morning. Tell us what happened, because anyone wants to hear the whole story, read the book. Your interview and your father's interview on 60 Minutes is brilliant. I don't want to replicate that. I want to get to the issues of today. But tell us what happened in the morning and then straight through. There you go.
I'll condense it. I'll give 1 minute to the question before. Why did we move there?
Yeah.
Because of our Zionist ideology, because we believe in the importance of this place.
You and Mary.
Me and Miri and I, it's a young couple, before we were married, before we had kids.
Yeah.
This kibbutz, Nahal Oz, it's the closest one to Gaza.
Uh-huh.
It suffered a lot over the years. I write about that history in the book.
Yeah.
It specifically went through a crisis in 2014. There was a tragedy. A 4-year-old child was killed in the kibbutz in the war of that summer between Israel and Hamas.
Yeah.
A lot of young families left because of it. And we decided that we were needed there at the time. That this young, exodus from the kibbutz, exodus of young families is a problem.
Yeah.
And we want to come down there and strengthen the community. So we moved there. We fell in love with the place. We found a community to belong to, which I think, Brian, is actually a universal theme today.
Oh, yeah.
We live in a world where loneliness is a big problem.
Yeah.
And people are looking for something to belong to.
Yeah.
We found that in the kibbutz, and, we got married there, 2016. We built a house there. We became a family there. We had 2 daughters born. Yeah. And on the eve of October 7, this kibbutz, Nahal Oz, was actually preparing to celebrate its 70-year anniversary.
Right.
The kibbutz was founded in October 1953.
Yeah.
And on October 7, 2023, there was supposed to be a party at 7 p.m. in the communal pool of the kibbutz with all 450 residents. It's a rather small place. And more than 200 guests. And we were super excited ahead of that party.
Right. You were practicing the night before.
Yeah, our daughter was supposed to be on the stage dancing. It was great. It was a feeling of something good. And 2023 was a rough year in Israel for many reasons. There was this clash between the government and large sectors of the public. And this was kind of like a bright spot in our life at the time. There were a lot of disturbing things happening, but this was a good thing.
Yeah.
But instead of a day of celebration, it became a day of immense tragedy. And it started, like you said, at 6:30 in the morning when there was a mortar about to fall on our neighborhood.
No alerts, just the mortar itself.
Yeah, Nahal Oz is less than a mile from Gaza. So when there is a mortar or a rocket fired by Hamas into the kibbutz, usually there's a siren and then you have 7 seconds to reach shelter.
Yeah.
And there's no Iron Dome coverage.
Yeah.
You go to Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is well covered and protected by Iron Dome, and you have 60 to 90 seconds to seek shelter. And Iron Dome has more than 90% interception rate.
Yeah.
But Nahal Oz is so close, no Iron Dome and no time. And on that morning, strange enough, not even an alert. Basically, we heard, and that's how the book starts, the first sentence. At first, there was only a whistle.
Yeah.
So we wake up from this whistle that's indicating a mortar is about to fall near the house. And we run. There's a room in the house which is built of thick concrete. It's a stronger build than the rest of the house. We call it the safe room because it's safer to be in if there's an emergency. And it's also the bedroom of our 2 daughters. Because then if you have a siren in the middle of the night or 6:30 in the morning, the parents run to the children. Yeah, not the other way around.
And Galia and Carmel were one and...
So Galia at the time was 3.5 years old, and Carmel was 1 year and 9 months old. So they're very little.
Yeah.
They're sleeping. They don't wake up from this stuff, by the way, because, growing up in Nahal Oz, we had gone through many instances over the years, all these small wars between Israel and Hamas that don't always make the headlines for more than a day. And they're kind of used to it. So we run, we shut the room. There's this heavy metal door that you can close at times of emergency. And there's an iron plate with which you can cover the window. And once you do that, the room is supposed to protect you from the shrapnel and the explosion.
Right.
And at this point, we're calm. We've been through this before. We're basically barricading and waiting for instructions. When can we go out? Should we evacuate the kibbutz? Is this a new war? Is it like a one-off? We don't know, and we're waiting.
Yeah.
And on that morning, the wait pretty much ends around 7 a.m. when we begin to hear automatic gunfire on the grounds of the kibbutz, and we realize there is an invasion by Hamas.
Right.
Which is something that has never happened before, by the way. The 70-year history of the kibbutz, and I write about it in the book.
Yeah.
Never had there been a terrorist step foot inside the community. And that shows you the magnitude of the failure from the Israeli perspective.
Right.
As this community has been on the border 70 years, there have always been people in Gaza who wanted to kill the people of Nahal Oz. There have always been also people in Gaza who wanted to live in peace and have great relationships. And I write in the book about both elements of history.
Right.
But you never, ever had a terrorist step foot in the kibbutz. And on that morning, you had more than 100. And pretty soon, our own home was surrounded by a group of Hamas terrorists. The house was locked, and all the windows, there's like electric blinds, they were rolled all the way down. We're barricading in the room with the 2 girls, no electricity, because the electricity fell out, so, no light, no food, a little bit of water. We have to stay very quiet because we don't want them to hear us. And we waited like this until almost 4 p.m. The biggest challenge was keeping the girls calm and quiet.
They were heroes, right?
They were really heroes, and
but you told them several times. Saba is fine. Tell us about Saba.
So not from the beginning, but
you distracted them at first.
At first, we
tried to get them back to sleep.
We basically tried to calm them. I mean, the most important thing was kind of soothing talk. Talking kind of relaxed voice, and don't show your own emotion because that can impact children. You have to show them that things are under control. And I called my parents to tell them what was going on. My parents live in Tel Aviv, which, by the way, is only an hour and 15 minutes from the Gaza border area. Israel is a small country.
1-5, right? Hour 15.
Yeah, hour 15 minutes. It's very close. My parents on that day are 62 years old. My father, Nahal Tibon, is a retired Israeli general. He served in the army until 2014.
Yeah.
So by this point, he's a decade out. My mom, Gali, she's a Holocaust historian and for many years was a high school principal. And we used to say her job is more dangerous than his.
Yeah.
And if you spend enough time around teenagers, you know it's true. And, they were on the beach in Tel Aviv. And I called them just to say, listen, this is not your regular round of fighting with Hamas. All the years we were in Nahal Oz, we had these incidents and they learned not to panic. We learned not to panic. It was part of life. But on that morning, I tell them, listen, this is different. There is an invasion. Their kibbutz is being taken over by Hamas. My father tried at first to call people he knows in the army. He thought this is like a local incident.
Right.
A few terrorists somehow cross the border and the army just needs to get there and take care of it. But he called and nobody answered.
Mm-hmm.
And basically at that point, they made a very unusual decision to drive down to Nahal Oz themselves.
With weapons.
My father has a pistol. Israel is not a country where you can have weapons at home unless you're a soldier.
It's not America?
Sorry. Well, for good and bad comparisons.
Yeah.
But in Israel, you can have a pistol at home. If you're a soldier, of course, you can have the M16. But my father is a retired soldier. So he had a pistol. He wanted to go alone. But my mom said, you need two hands. One, this is a good time to, a good moment for some whiskey.
Yeah.
My mom said you need two hands. One on the pistol, one with your phone to try to call Amir, to try to call neighbors in the kibbutz. They know all of our neighbors, friends, to call people in the army. So she said, I'm driving.
Yeah.
A 62-year-old grandma. And they went off. I'm not going to tell everything that happened to them. There were many adventures on the way.
But they saved many people.
They had to turn around several times to save other people before they could get to us because people were in danger. And there is this foundational value in Israeli society. I'll say it in Hebrew and then I'll translate it. לא משאירים פצועים בשטח, which means you don't leave wounded behind.
Yeah.
And, for my father being a military man, this was something that is in his DNA. And so when they saw people along the way, a couple that was almost murdered after escaping the Nova Festival.
Right, yeah.
And injured soldiers that had to be taken to the hospital, they stopped and they turned around and they helped them.
Yeah.
It all took a lot of time. My mom never made it to the kibbutz on that day because at some point they split and she took 3 injured soldiers to the hospital and saved their lives. Mm-hmm. We're in touch with them today. One of them had a boy that was born after this. And my father did make it around 1:30 p.m. And he joined the first group of soldiers that had entered the kibbutz from the Maglan unit and the Givati unit. They began to scan the kibbutz from home to home. And we, in the small room with the small girls, we had no idea any of this was happening, but we did know my parents were on their way.
We're on the way. And tell me, has anyone bought the rights to your book yet? Because he's a hero. He got into firefights himself. He grabs a fallen soldier.
So there is a documentary film that was produced by Barry Average, the Canadian director. It's called The Road Between Us.
Yes.
And we are interviewed in it and some of the other heroes of the day, people who are mentioned in the book, Nissan and Barry from the local security team of the kibbutz.
Right.
And the wife of Ilan Fiorentino, the security chief, my neighbor.
Yeah.
But basically, to make a very long story short, my father joined the soldiers. They scanned the kibbutz from house to house to house. And we didn't know all of this because our phones had died somewhere between, I would say, 12:30 p.m. to 1 p.m. We lost the phones.
So you didn't know that they were coming, but you also didn't know that your friends and the members of your community exactly what was happening to them because they
knew some of it. We knew some of it.
Your book reconstructs this, and I can't imagine how hard it would have been. You went through a trauma, but then people who are your friends and neighbors, and if I recall, the terrorists, Hamas terrorists, actually live streaming.
Yes.
The capture.
The kidnapping of Tzachi Idan, a good friend of mine who actually... on the day that we are recording this podcast, we are mentioning 1 year since his body was returned from Gaza.
Right. Yeah.
So it's all,
but you didn't know that was happening at the time. You're in this uncertainty and you're mostly trying to keep your kids quiet and everything.
Exactly. And so at some point when, the girls were losing patience, because it's very hard for kids that young age we started telling them that if they stay quiet, Saba will come, grandfather.
Yeah, because he spoils them like grandpas do, right?
And we had to promise something. You can't just tell the kids, oh,
yeah,
be quiet, be quiet.
Yeah.
And they did stay quiet until we heard this knock on the window of the safe room around 3:45 p.m. And we heard his voice. And we opened the door for the first time. He came in, we hugged, we embraced. And then, just last minute I will devote to this. After that, basically, our house became like an evacuation point. They brought all the neighbors, the soldiers brought all the neighbors to our house. And those were really difficult hours because every person that comes, you're super happy and excited to see them alive. But you start to notice who is not coming.
Yeah.
And you understand the magnitude. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, apart from just telling the story, was also in order to reconstruct, like you said, because when you go out of the safe room, and this is something a lot of people who survived that day.
And you were in your boxers, right?
Yeah. You are clueless.
Yeah.
You know something terrible happened.
Yeah, but you don't know what
you kind of pick up bits and pieces and you pick up bits and pieces and there's rumors, but you don't really have the full picture.
Yeah.
So researching the events of the day for the book, for me, was really a form of therapy.
Oh.
Just to understand, who are the soldiers that came? What happened in the long hours until they arrived? Basically, why are we alive?
Yeah.
That's the question.
No, and I've gone to some of the screenings that the Israeli embassy and others of the films, and I have very mixed views. I don't know if I even want to get into that.
You mean like the Hamas original?
No, the directors were Hamas, and
the raw material that Hamas filmed with their
streamed it, and
there's, by the way, from our house as well. There is a video showing them on our porch in a gun battle with my next door neighbor who was the kibbutz chief of security.
Yeah, and actually maybe after the episode I'd love to talk to you about my mixed views on that, because it really does display, and it's important to display, the evil that was there. But then I wonder what effect it has.
It's important, but if it's out of context, then it's just terrible images and that's it.
Yeah.
And the other side can also produce terrible images.
Right.
So if that's the kind of war we are fighting in the public diplomacy sphere,
right?
We show their atrocities and they show their,
and then we get to nowhere, right?
Okay, where does that leave us, basically?
Yeah, but what's beautiful about your book, and you put a image later in the book of your daughters a few days before.
Yes.
Looking out on the horizon.
5 days before, this like beautiful idyllic picture, in the fields surrounding the kibbutz. You see the paradise element.
Yeah, but you're saved, but this mix of emotion. Tell us, what is bamba?
The first thing we brought to the girls after we were able to bring food, 4 p.m. was bamba, which is a very popular Israeli snack made of peanut butter.
Yeah.
By the way, there are research papers about this, that there is a relatively low level of peanut allergy in Israel and nut allergies in general. And some people believe it has to do with the early exposure to bamba.
Yeah. So just the mix of emotions, and you're saved, but other people aren't. You don't know what's going on. One other question. Sorry, it sounds frivolous, but Pluto. Who was Pluto?
Pluto is our dog. His story, let's leave for people to leave. It's an unbelievable story. I mean,
but because the human should be the focus here, and there's so much tragedy. There's so much,
But a lot of people actually, and you're not the first one, Brian, actually ask me about the dog. It's like a constant thing.
Yeah.
And
because people relate. It's what you were saying.
If you have a dog,
yeah,
and I've been a dog person all my life.
Yeah.
So you kind of put yourself in that person's shoes. It actually makes it easier for people to connect with the story.
Right.
Because, if I write about my family, my children, so, you can detach yourself a bit in a way. You say, well, they live over there. I have my life over here.
Yeah.
But once the dog enters the picture, in a way, people read it and say, wait a second, I also have a dog. And that's a connection that makes people relate.
Yeah, but it's all human. And the one thing I wanted to ask you before we move on to sort of the bigger picture questions and where we are now is nothing really prepares you for the trauma and the atrocities like this. A few weeks ago, we had Imad Shargi, who was detained unjustly for 5 years and tortured in prison in Iran. And he talked about isolation and things like this. And 10 hours, I can imagine, felt like years. And you don't know what happens at the back end of this.
Yeah.
Was there anything, when you look back on that and that experience, when you can't prepare really for it, but what are the sorts of things that you and Mary did? I mean, your kids, amazing at 3 and 1 and incredible, but what are things that
I think
that sustained you?
I think something that helped us on that day, and I write about it in the book, is that Miri, in her profession, is a social worker.
Yeah.
And she works with children on the autistic spectrum.
Okay.
That's her day job. And that's what she was doing before October 7. And a short time after October 7, after we had to leave our home and we were basically refugees in our own country, moved to a kibbutz in the north of Israel that adopted our community. Very soon she went back to work in the same field, just in a different location. It's her calling.
Yeah.
And I think she used tools from her professional work on that morning in order to keep our girls and ourselves really calm. And so I give her a lot of credit for
Just
that.
how you talk and your tone.
Yes,
and
the
things
importance
like
of a calm and
this. Did you come into a training in like the workplace? And
maybe there's an opening there.
one last thing on the ordeal, what struck me also, because you take us there as the reader, and you're evacuated, and the kids are sleeping, all the kids, and nobody really knows what to say. It's sort of a shock that you're in.
That we're like sitting, everybody. Yeah, I remember those are the first days after October 7. It's like a mixture of things that I never imagined would happen in my life, like interviewing to 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
And meeting President Biden, who had come to Israel.
We would talk about,
10 days after, the only American president to visit Israel during wartime under fire.
Yeah.
So these crazy experiences, and then going back to the dorm room that we were sharing, our family, and we're sleeping on 4 mattresses on the floor.
Yeah.
And there's like a hallway with a bathroom, and all the kids of the kibbutz nobody can sleep. All the adults, people are like sleepwalking. People are waking up, screaming in the middle of the night. And it's like the distance between the two things. Like you have, like I get texts from my friends in America. Oh my God, I saw you on 60 Minutes. And I'm reading them when I'm like on this mattress on the floor. Yeah, like, it's...
No, but the other thing was the onslaught that you just turned it off, the media onslaught. This is something, again, in a minor way, think tanks, everybody deals with. Who knows what will happen with Iran, but this is like, it just hits you. It's ever present.
Yeah.
And then it reframes things in ways if you don't disengage from it, right?
Yeah, but I did like the 60 Minutes interview, and after that it was actually pretty easy to refuse to interviews because we did this one big thing.
Yeah, thanks.
And then I said, okay, now I have to deal with my life because
where
are the girls gonna go? Like, where's gonna be the kindergarten? What about my job? What about Miri's job?
Right, you got details.
We have friends who are kidnapped in Gaza. Right. And we're trying to support their families who are down the hallway from us. It's not like they're in a better situation.
Yeah.
So, all of this kind of you had to deal with all of it at the same time.
So let's carry it forward now to the moment that we're in.
2.5 years later.
How have all of these experiences changed your views is the broader question, but the basic question, where are you guys living now? And do you plan to go back?
So right now we are still in Mishmar HaEmek, which is the kibbutz that opened their door and their heart to us.
Yeah.
Half a year we lived in these dormitories. Then they brought trailers. And they built like a trailer neighborhood for us.
Yeah.
And today we are still, I would say, almost 20 families there. Yeah. Many others have already returned to Nahal Oz. Basically, since the ceasefire of October 2025, you have had this growing trend of families moving back to Nahal Oz and some of the other border communities, but they are still not at capacity. We are staying there until the end of the school year. We decided we don't want to move the girls in the middle of the school year.
But you're going back.
But in July, we're going back home. Wow. And we renovated our house.
Great.
And we're going there on weekends. We sleep there on the weekend. We bring the girls over. They love going there. So...
Can I come down and we do a foodie tour, Southern Israel?
Let's do it.
Okay,
let's do it. You just
all right.
went.
It's all about me. No,
but that's that's something that we are. I'll say honestly, we have the conflicted feelings about it.
Yeah,
we feel it's the right thing to do for us as a family, and also we still believe in the mission of this place and the importance of it. You can argue that October 7 even made it more important.
Yeah.
There is this little problem that we don't trust our government to protect us.
We are going to talk about
and that creates questions in your heart.
It's huge. And I can't imagine, because you basically had to rely not on a system. I mean, I didn't ask you this, but your book depicts this, that there were far fewer troops on the border of Gaza than there were in the West Bank. And it was in part because you don't say it in this way, but it's the settlement enterprise. It's also Hamas, perhaps in the months before.
There was a deception that Hamas really played, which was a smart one, where you had, they made all kinds of side deals with Israel, mostly through Qatari mediation, to kind of show here Gaza is calm.
Yeah.
And you had an uptick of attacks in the West Bank. And so there was a lot more military presence over there, and the Gaza border really, they decreased the amount of troops.
Yeah.
And that's just one aspect of it. But another aspect is, after 9/11, for example, here in the U.S., you had a commission that investigated it. And in the past in Israel, we also used to have this.
But you haven't had this yet.
2.5 years, and the government is refusing to set up a state commission of inquiry.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that in a second. You are a two-state guy, like you. So let me first say this: you wrote a book, and I wish I have it somewhere in my disorganized life in my home library. The Last Palestinian with Grant Rumley. By the way, he mentioned to me that you're both Michigan State people, and that he came down while he was writing the book with you. And I think he said he dunked on you when you played basketball, and like he's so much better of a basketball player than you are. That's what he told me. Is that true?
Because I respect him and I love him, I'm not going to respond to.
No, I made that up. Grant, I made that up.
No, I can definitely see him say that. But yeah, he's a dear friend and one of the smartest people in this. We're recording here in Washington D.C., so I think one of the smartest people in this city.
He's a gem
to our part of the world.
No, he's a gem.
And when we worked on The Last Palestinian together, the question that you are about to ask me, is the two-state solution still viable? It was relevant back then, and this is a book from a decade ago.
Right.
And it's still relevant today, but I think the situation is even more dire in a sense than it was when we were writing The Last Palestinian.
Yeah, because in the chapters that you articulate the history, and I lived some of that. I lived over there, and some of the names.
In the 90s.
Yeah, I was living in Ramallah, Gaza, but the names like Baruch Goldstein.
Yeah.
Or Yigal Amir, who's still alive but in prison, and this is a guy who killed Yitzhak Rabin.
He killed more than Yitzhak Rabin,
This is tell me more.
He killed the hope of an entire country.
Yeah. No, because I think a lot of his ideas, I'm going to be bold here, but a lot of what Yigal Amir believed in that drove him to murder are the sorts of things that are unfolding these days.
Yeah, he one of the most successful assassins in political history.
Yeah. So how has being under siege by terrorists of Hamas, but not the people of Gaza, right? And how is, but yeah, you may have many mixed views. How's your view changed on this?
It's not that my views has changed. It's just, I want to, again, to put everything honestly on the table. One of the biggest sources of disappointment, let's say, for peace-seeking Israelis was the fact that alongside the Hamas terrorists, you had thousands of Palestinian civilians who came into the communities on the border on October 7th to loot and steal and participate in some of the atrocities. Now, I am not disappointed by Hamas because I never had any expectations from Hamas. Hamas is a terror organization.
Yeah.
And they have been on a mission to murder Israelis. And beyond that, to kill any hope for a two-state solution since their foundation. Right? And this is both in The Last Palestinian and in the Gates of Gaza, something that I think comes through if you read it.
Yeah.
That there is this unholy alliance, you can call it, between fanatic religious extremists on the Palestinian and the Israeli side against any idea of common life and coexistence and the political solution. They both don't want it. So from Hamas, there is nothing to be disappointed.
Right.
But I think for a lot of people in these border communities, which are affiliated with the left wing politically in Israel.
Yeah.
And these are people who supported the two-state solution. Some of them volunteered in helping Palestinians, driving Palestinians from Gaza to Israeli hospitals. The fact that Hamas terrorists came into slaughter was not a surprise. But the fact that ordinary civilians followed through was a sense of shock. and I think still reverberates and impacts people thinking.
So sorry for the think tanky question, but what's your new concept? What's your concept for Israeli-Palestinian? Where are you?
No, that hasn't changed really.
You're still a two-stater.
It's not about being a supporter of the two-state solution or not. It's just that I don't see a better alternative, really.
Yeah.
I mean, what is a Yugoslavia kind of situation? Okay, we create one state, and then what? I mean, you have basically today a level of hatred, suspicion, and just fear between the two people, the Israelis and the Palestinians, I think at the highest level in my lifetime, for sure.
Right.
And you need, first of all, to deal with that reality, with the level of fear that Israelis feel after October 7 and after the ordeal of the hostages who were there for 2 years, and now they're all coming back and telling stories of torture. And from the Palestinian side, 2 years of war, destruction, suffering in Gaza, bombardments, people, becoming refugees, losing their homes, families being killed. The level of fear and hatred right now is just so high. So to talk about, let's just put down the borders and it will be a one state, I think is really, really naive.
Yeah.
The two-state solution is also very difficult in this current moment to create. But I do think that at least in the long run, maybe not tomorrow morning, it still makes more sense.
Yeah. Now, the deficit of leadership, which we'll talk about, I want to ask some questions about what's going on in Israel these days. But I had a podcast, not taking the edge off, but on the Middle East Institute's main podcast, the summer of 2023. So before all of this.
Before it happened, yeah.
With Itamar Rabinovich.
Okay, yeah.
And he had a book.
Former Israeli ambassador.
An advisor to Rabin.
Yeah.
And I go back and listen to that every once in a while. Not a lot.
And he wrote a great book about Rabin, by the way.
No, it was a good book about Rabin. He had a book that was out in 23, and we put it on the main podcast, which you can find on MEI's website. And he basically said the deficit of leadership, not only in Israel, but around the region, is a key problem. We're going to get into that. You may need another sip of, because we're going to get into what does the last 2.5 years mean for Israel and its futures. So I'm going to load up myself. I don't know about you, but let's buckle up. We're going to talk about Israel and its politics and where things are right now. Now, let's rewind before October 7th. You alluded to this. We talked a little bit about it was actually really beautiful weather, too, when we had that.
That's usually true in Israel, though.
It was wonderful.
That's usually the case.
You and Esther, I have a fond memory of that lunch, and it was so nice and good. But in 2023, it was a tough year for Israel before the October 7th attacks. And in the book, you talk about how you took your 2 young daughters to their first demonstration. Is that right?
Indeed.
And people in America here may feel this moment, right? Because we've had our own divisions. Don't know if you've noticed.
Just a tiny bit.
We've got some stuff going on.
A tiny bit, yeah.
But you talk about how fellow Israelis stopped to curse, spit, and threaten. And one truck driver actually yelling at you, "Fucking leftists, I hope Hamas kills your children."
That happened.
This was
just a few months before.
And that was to you, and you were standing up for what?
So 2023, right after the election at the end of 2022, you have this new government sworn in, an old Prime Minister, Netanyahu. He comes back to power after a year and a half of what we call the government of change in Israel, this short-lived government with Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid that replaced Netanyahu, but he overcomes them, he comes back, and he creates the most extreme coalition in really Israeli political history. In Israel, we don't have a two-party system, and we don't have a presidential system like you guys.
Yeah.
Governing is always through a coalition of several parties, because we have a multi-party system in our parliament. And historically, Netanyahu usually preferred, even though he's a right-wing leader, to include more moderate, centrist parties in his coalitions for reasons of both internal and external political calculations.
Yeah.
But this time he comes in and he creates what we would say a pure far-right coalition. It's his Likud party, which has veered very much to the right over the years. It's the ultra-Orthodox, this very, very religious, strict segment of Israeli society, and the far right, including people that he himself a year or two earlier said would never be part of his coalition because they are so extreme, like Itamar Ben-Gvir.
Yeah.
And he puts him in charge of the police.
So Netanyahu does this, in your assessment, just because he wants to stay on the power?
I think he does it because this is the most convenient government for him at that moment. Remember, he's standing trial for corruption.
Yeah.
And he wants to dismantle the judicial system in order to end his own trial. Remember, back then, Joe Biden is president in the U.S., so he doesn't have the call the White House lifeline, which he's been trying to use right now, convincing Trump to put pressure on the Israeli judicial authorities and the Israeli president to basically cancel his trial. Back then, he can't do that because Biden would not cooperate. But he does have a plan in 2023. And the plan is basically to dismantle the judiciary and take over that branch and make it, I would say, under the boot of the government.
So obliterate the checks and balances that exist between the different branches of your government, essentially, right?
Yes, because in Israel, the parliament is not as independent as your Congress. The American Congress, the members are elected separately from the president. A lot of times, the party that is opposite to the president wins control of at least one of the two houses of Congress. It's a different system.
Yeah.
In Israel, the parliament is really controlled by the government. The only real check on the power of the government is the judiciary. And when Netanyahu tries to dismantle the judiciary and put it under his control, that sends hundreds of thousands of Israelis out to the streets because people realize this is a fight for our very, I would say, basically freedom. Because if you have a government that is so extreme and the only power that can restrain it are the courts.
Yeah.
And then they try to take over the courts. After that, they could do anything.
Right.
And this becomes a huge protest movement that pretty soon washes all over the country, including in our little area, the Gaza border area. People come out to demonstrate, and it's an area where people with different political views mostly get along most of the time. But the response to these demonstrations coming directly from Netanyahu is to describe the protesters as anarchists, terror supporters, traitors, and that eventually fuels this very aggressive, angry, violent sometimes response that was happening.
So we have had moments like this, and certainly we're in one right now. I think after 9/11, there was the politicization of a lot of national security. I've written a lot about this, and that people were branding from the right, people who were Democrats as in bed with terrorists.
Yeah.
People forget about this, but the swift boating of John Kerry, Max Cleland in 2002 in the Senate election, who was a veteran, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff has echoes, and I actually think it would be a brilliant thing to talk about sometime, maybe afterwards, after this episode, of the parallels, because they're not precise, but they're...
And also, it was not invented here in the U.S. I mean, you go back to, just political history of the 20th century, and you see this time and again, when you have a government that is trying to consolidate power and trample on other institutions, it's very easy to describe any opposition as traitors, as unloyal to the country. And it's true that most people in these demonstrations were more representative of the Israeli left, but you also had people coming from the moderate, more conservative right who stood up and said, wait a second, I can be a right-winger on the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I can be against the Palestinian state, but I also want to have an independent court in Israel because I don't want to live in a tyrannical state.
Yeah, no, and that sort of, but the bigger meta point I was trying to make was that open societies, and you think Israel is a democracy, but a flawed one, right? Like some people,
like many democracies today,
that are flawed.
Yes.
But open societies are quite vulnerable strategically these days to external forces. And true or false? Do you agree with this? It's my view that authoritarian and terrorist groups have exploited the divisions in open societies like ours to their benefit. Well, do you think Hamas plotted this and they were watching what was happening inside of Israel?
I am convinced that they were watching the situation in Israel and sensing an opportunity. But even if you can argue that this was not their main motivation, because they also had other motivations. They wanted to scuttle Israeli-Saudi negotiations that were happening during that time under Biden. and they felt like this government was very extreme, and perhaps they were worried about some of the steps it wanted to take in the West Bank or around Temple Mount, Haram Sharif. But I'm sure the internal situation in Israel played a role in it, and also it distracted us as a society, as a country, and our institutions from paying attention to what Hamas was openly saying. I mean, I bring in the book an interview with a senior Hamas official, Salah Harouri. He's now dead. But a month and a half before October 7, he brags about how the Israeli military is stretched out in the West Bank, and there are so many battalions there. Now, he doesn't say, and they have no coverage of Gaza. But if you're following and listening, that's basically the conclusion.
Right.
When he brags about we have forced them to concentrate all their soldiers in the West Bank, that means he's making a deliberate calculation about where Israel doesn't have enough soldiers. But that kind of interview barely made the headlines in Israel. Nobody noticed it because the country and the systems and the media, everything was consumed by this gigantic clash over the identity of the country.
The internal fight,
Yeah.
and that was exploited. So your community suffered this grievous attack. How quickly did Benjamin Netanyahu, as prime minister, come down and express his condolences directly to you? Like, was it just a matter of a few days or a few weeks? When did that happen?
A few years, because it hasn't happened yet. He
Wait.
has not visited our kibbutz. He has not met with our people.
Well, no, I'm confused because you say in the book that the former prime minister, Naftali Bennett, who was not in power at the time, came down
After a week.
Yeah, after a week. But the
After a
book came out like in 24, and here we are in 2026. He still has not.
No. He visited. I will give him one kind of, I will give him credit for visiting one neighboring community to ours, which was hit even more terribly than Nahal Oz. It's called Nir Oz. It's 20 minutes south of us. In that kibbutz, basically one of every 4 people was either murdered or kidnapped. Netanyahu visited them in the summer of 2025, 2 years after the attack. To our community, he has not bothered to show up. And we had visits by Bennett and Lapid and other opposition figures, but Netanyahu, no.
Did
nothing.
your father take any heat? Did he make any statements? I mean, he's like a national hero.
Well, it's very interesting because what happened from very early on is that supporters of Netanyahu, and not all of them, but some prominent Netanyahu supporters in the media or social media influencers began to attack him because they couldn't take the idea that somebody who is a critic of Netanyahu is becoming like a national hero. So they began with all kinds of accusations. He only saved his family. He didn't help anybody else. He let everybody else get slaughtered. Lies that basically it's defamation, and we're treating it through legal means right now. But it's part, sadly, of the political reality today. And I do want to say that there were other people who probably don't agree with me politically, wouldn't vote for the same party that I vote, don't necessarily read Haaretz, who came out against this and basically said, agree or disagree with Nahal Tibon, with Amir Tibon, but don't tell lies about somebody just because you don't agree with their politics.
What about external leaders? You mentioned, you wrote an article, it's not in the book, but Angela Merkel, who was the German chancellor.
Yes.
Were there others? But what did that mean to you to have someone from Germany come and visit and things like this?
So it was very interesting. A few months ago, I get a phone call from the German ambassador in Israel, Stefan Seibert. He's a wonderful diplomat, and he has been supporting the Nahal Oz community from the first days after October 7. And he calls me and he says, Amir, I have a little request. He said, Chancellor Merkel is coming to Israel. She received an honorary doctorate from the Weizmann Institute, which is the most important scientific institution in Israel. And it's a very low-key visit. She's not meeting any politicians. She's not doing any press. But she wants to visit a kibbutz that was attacked on October 7th. She wants to see with her own eyes what happened.
Yeah.
Do you mind hosting her in Nahal Oz? And I immediately said yes. I thought it's important. And also I was intrigued by the opportunity to meet this woman. I think she's one of the more interesting leaders in the world in my lifetime.
Yeah, of the free world. Yeah.
For a while.
Yeah.
Not free of error and mistakes.
Of course.
Specifically, I think on the question of immigration. But still someone I really respect. And so she came to Nahal Oz. And she came to my house. By this point, we had almost finished renovating the house, so you couldn't really see the damages of that day. But still, I took her to the room where we barricaded with the girls. She asked if we could turn off the lights and seal the window like it was on October 7th, so she could feel the darkness that enveloped us on that day.
Yeah.
And we walked around the kibbutz, and every person we met, from those who had already returned to live there, she stopped and asked some questions and was very humble, like not full of herself.
Yeah.
Like just down to earth. It was really amazing. And my favorite part of that day, there is a small group of German Zionist Christians who like support Israel. And it's related to all this, interesting German-Israeli history. I won't go into it. It can be a different podcast. But there's a group of them, they're volunteering in the kibbutz. It's guys in their 50s, I would say 60s. So they're like just walking in one of those little alleys of the kibbutz after having lunch in the dining hall. And suddenly they see the chancellor in front of them. they were kind of shocked. But even to them, she just came and shook their hands and asked them a few questions in German and continued on.
Yeah. So you're planning to move back
in July. Yes.
So bigger question, and tee up this, but I worry about whether Israelis are leaving their country. And I see this negative migration statistic. My wife and I and our kid Ben, we call him BB. Just kidding. No, we don't. No, and Israeli. No, we don't call him BB.
King.
No, BB King. No, we don't. It's a joke. We have people move in from Israel, right? Not just diplomats, but there are more and more and dear friends. But there's a reverse migration, right?
And I think there's an interesting situation right now. A lot of people in Israel are kind of losing hope. Because October 7 happened. And it was such a terrible tragedy and such a collapse of the state. And the collapse was not just on October 7 itself, but it continued into October 8, 9, 10, in the sense that people who were hurt, people who lost their homes, people who lost their families, they didn't really get any help from the government. There was a lot of help coming from the American Jewish community, which really came through for us big time. There was a lot of help from organizations, NGOs, but the government was nowhere to be seen. And then fast forward, it's more than 2 years later, we still have the same government in place. The war is officially over, but is it really over? I mean,
start.
Missiles from Iran, from Yemen. Hamas is still on its feet in Gaza. Hamas is much weaker, diminished, but it is still the ruling authority, de facto, of half of the Gaza Strip. There's no hope for peace on the horizon. I don't think anybody's talking about a peaceful reality. The internal problems in Israel are far from solved. The question of, the balance of power between the government and the judiciary, political extremism, service in the military. We have a huge problem in Israel, which is really a big issue in the news right now, that certain segments of the population, most importantly the ultra-Orthodox, which are represented in this government, are exempt from military service. So, all of my friends, hundreds of days of reserve duty, people with kids and jobs. My brother is a doctor in the military. He has a young boy, basically missed a year of his son's life almost, because he was constantly on duty. And yet an entire segment of the population doesn't serve and uses political power to exempt itself. So all of these factors together are pushing talented, smart, kind of like a lot of times the best of the country to move out. And I can tell you, Brian, that when you are in a time of crisis and you feel some danger or uncomfort, there is fight or flight mechanism.
Yeah.
And
I'm all about the flight by then.
I get it, but we are, as a family, I say, we are still in the fight.
Good.
In the fight mode.
And you think most of Israelis are still there too?
I think yes. And I really believe we can change the course of the country this year. Remember, we have an election in 2026, probably in September, October, but because of how our political system works, it can even be a little earlier. And I'm in fight mode. I believe we have hope to turn the ship around and to make things better in Israel and to put the country on a new course. But I can tell you sadly that it's true. Many friends of mine over the past 2 years have chosen the flight option, and I don't judge them. I mean, at the end of the day, you're responsible for your family.
Yeah.
You got to make decisions.
Well, wow, you and Mary and the kids are going back, and it's quite brave to do that, and kudos to you. I would say that. And let's turn to America here, and I know we're running a little bit long, but you're cool with
as long as the whiskey is here, I'm okay.
Okay, yeah.
And we're gonna need a drink for this portion, I think.
Yeah, okay. All right, I hear you, my man. All right, we're back at it, and for a variety of reasons, who cares?
You need it more than me, probably now.
Well, yeah. Who cares if we run a little bit long on this, and we can slice and dice as we see fit. I wanted to get into where we are in America. You're here. Why? Why are you here on this visit?
So, I'm now working. So my current role at Haaretz is to manage international partnerships for the newspaper.
Right. Yeah.
And there is the J Street.
There we go. What's J Street? Tell us what J Street is for
a Jewish American organization that supports the two-state solution. Yes, and they are having their big annual conference. The weekend we are recording this, I'm going to be there on behalf of Haaretz.
Yeah.
And I also had, before I came to Washington, D.C., two speaking engagements down in Florida, actually, sharing my story from October 7th. So I get a little, kind of trip in the U.S.
Well, we're lucky to have you. So let's start here. You met Joe Biden as president.
Right after October 7th.
When he visited in the attack. And in the interview in 60 Minutes that you did that people should definitely watch, you said, and this is actually powerful for me, I think it's important. It sounds soft to a lot of people, but you felt the love of Joe Biden. And I don't know if your views changed after 2.5 years war, because some people in this country, and including people who I think will be at the J Street conference, call him Genocide Joe.
Yeah, okay. Listen, first of all, I don't use the word genocide in the context of the Gaza war, and I was writing in favor of stopping the war for quite a long time, writing week after week, multiple columns explaining why we need to stop the war.
Yeah.
And I think as far, I'm a proud Israeli, proud Zionist, but I understand why people have very strong criticism of some of Israel's actions in this war. But I think the word genocide is an exaggeration and is not really connected to what happened.
Yeah, I don't
use it.
Yeah, I don't want to get down that rabbit hole, and I generally
it will get a lot of hate traffic.
No, but it's part of narratives, and hate traffic is fine. But I like a sensible human discussion. And
but I will say about Biden, I also understand people who are critical of Biden in terms of how he handled the war, especially I would say in the last month of his presidency.
Yeah.
And I also wrote very, very clearly, you can go back to my columns from the summer and the fall of 2024 about the urgency of forcing a deal to end the war, save the hostages. And sadly, such a deal only happened when the threat of Trump becoming angry was already at the door for Israel, for Netanyahu, for Qatar, Hamas. And I think Biden could have done things differently.
Yeah.
And I think, sadly, it was impacted by political calculations and the idea that he's running for re-election and he has a more traditional understanding of where the American public is regarding Israel and the meaning of a confrontation with an Israeli prime minister during an election year.
I just think, my view is that was bad politics. Like the problem Biden had, or Harris then later, there's this report of a DNC study.
That was very,
That was not the problem. The problem was we're going to have a foreign policy for the middle class while inflation was raging. The problem was no discernible immigration issue. And this is a hard part. This is important for the Middle East policy wonks like you and I. But sadly, even at the height of the campus protests I want to talk about and things like this, ordinary American voters did not care about this issue. And that's hard to understand, I'm sure.
No, I actually fully understand it. I mean, how much do I know and understand about terrible things that are happening in the world right now?
Right.
And I'm a person who reads, my second favorite newspaper is The Economist, because you kind of get like a glimpse of every region in the world.
Amazing.
And you learn what's happening in Nigeria and what's happening in Burma, and Myanmar. But okay, I mean, how much do you really understand? So I also get it that most Americans, even if they're watching the news and they care about this, this is happening far away.
Yeah. So, but there is this data point that came out this week, I think. I don't know if you saw it in the Financial Times reported this, but the Gallup poll.
Oh, of course.
In more than 2 decades of polling, Americans sympathize more now today with Palestinians, 41%.
First time ever that it's been recorded.
Versus Israelis, 35%. Now, I don't know if you know this about me. I worked for a couple of years with Stan Greenberg, James Carville, and others in polling. So I read polling, and part of me when I read this, you can agree or disagree. Yes, this is a trend, but I also see this as a nonsense question. Why? Because
I hate that question. I've been a crusade against that question.
Yeah.
I think it's a ridiculous question.
Either or.
No, like also sympathize with, like, that's not even a political
No, but
position.
here's my view. I think it's your view, as I understand it as a two-stater, is that you could be pro-Israel and pro-Palestine.
100%.
Right, and the dichotomous nature, because it just feeds into this
But
thing.
Brian, having said all that,
Yeah.
the movement relative to the stupid question still matters. You can say it's a stupid question.
100%.
It's not.
100%. I agree with
But
yeah.
when you have a trend over, it's a 10-year trend, but it escalated over the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And on top of it, you have to remember the amount of support for Israel that existed in this country right after October 7. And it's true that from October 8, there were attempts to minimize, deny, and justify October 7.
Yeah.
From October 8, it's one of the motivations for me to write the book, to tell the story, because I saw how people were twisting and making up things, and like I said, even justifying the atrocities. So it's true that there was really, I think, an organized campaign to twist reality around October 7 by powerful forces that hate Israel and hate Jews.
Yeah.
Having said all that, in the beginning, it was very clear that most Americans are horrified by what happened, and that there is a consensus around supporting Israel in that moment. And I don't think Biden took any political damage for coming to Israel on October 18 and hugging Israelis. The problems began a few months later, when it was clear that A, the war is not ending,
right,
and B, that the war is not really leading anywhere.
Yeah.
Because there was, Biden already on October 18, when he came to Israel, spoke with Netanyahu about drawing the day after.
Yeah.
Basically, okay, what's your plan for Gaza at the end of this war? How do you envision it? And Netanyahu refused to discuss it.
Yeah.
And until today, really, he refuses to discuss it. There is a Trump plan, but it was forced on him by Trump.
But it doesn't have a clear endpoint, the 20-point plan, in my view. And this is the problem Biden had. And I don't know if you know this, like, not a lot of people read my work at MEI, really, or from MEI, but I do.
Everybody listens to the podcast.
Yeah, that's it. They're like, they're walking down the street listening to us talk here. But I do these report cards. I've done them from the Biden administration to the current one. And I get some guff these days for giving, I'm a tough grader, right? Sorry. But like I evaluate according to outcome and things like this. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement in U.S. policy, so especially over the last year or so.
Yeah.
But I gave really tough grades under Biden, too. I'm not being defensive at all, and people want to debate it. Bring me your alternative, right?
Show me the achievements.
Yeah, exactly.
Show me the aims.
And my main criticism of the Biden team, and these are friends and they get mad at me, whatever, is that they were too tactical, crisis management driven, rather than actually. And the key thing here is this, and it's important in life and it's important in policy, is if you don't have a clearly defined end state that you're driving towards, then you're actually going to get lost, or your tactics will get shifted.
Or you will make up something along the way and turn that into your goal, which a lot of times turns out badly. Like, for example, what Netanyahu did in 2025 and actually convinced Trump to come along for the ride.
Yeah.
To stop all the humanitarian aid into Gaza.
Right.
Renew the war, basically breaking the ceasefire Trump had secured in January 2025.
Yeah.
And then bring in these American contractor companies to build humanitarian aid centers in Gaza. And the whole thing just became a total disaster.
Yeah. So I wish we had another episode where we can talk about where we are right now with Board of Peace, with everything that's being constructed, because I actually think it is missing a moment. Other people have different views, but I think it's...
I'll tell you something about it?
Yeah.
It's far from perfect, and it contains a lot of problems, but it's the only game in town. And for me, as someone who's planning to go there with his family this summer,
you want it to work.
I want it to succeed.
Yeah.
With all the criticism that I have and how I think it could have been different. And, if Jared Kushner had called me, Jared Kushner is a fan of The Last Palestinian.
He is?
There is several instances where he publicly praised I don't think he read The Gates of Gaza. At least hasn't referred to it.
Jared Kushner, you gotta get a copy. I'm telling you.
There are several instances where he spoke about the last Palestinians.
Yeah.
So if he invited me for his local book club, probably I would give some ideas on how to improve the 20-point plan. But having said that, it's the only plan.
Right.
And if it doesn't succeed, God help us. That means renewing the war. That means all the terrible things that happen in Gaza happen again.
Yeah.
From the Israeli perspective, we lose soldiers. We become once again, shunned completely in the world. The trend in Gallup becomes a tsunami. That's just nobody wins in that scenario. Nobody wins. So that plan, with all of its problems, it's the only one.
You got to make it work.
Yeah.
All right. So we took up a lot of people's time, your time, and things like this. Absolute last set of questions. How'd you get into this line of work?
Journalism, you mean, right?
Yeah. And what was the spark? That's the first question. And then part B is, if you were talking to the next generation and they wanted to follow in your footsteps, in your vocation, I'm talking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, get a lovely wife and have 2 kids. And
first of all, get married and have kids. Program, wife, husband, whatever you want, but get married.
How did you get into it, and what do you advise the next generation?
I loved writing from a very, very young age and reading. I was like a library kid, you can say. And I started writing for local newspapers in Tel Aviv when I was, I think, like 13, 14-year-old.
What?
I wrote about sports.
Cool.
NBA. I wrote about, like school issues, like, if there was like some kind of controversy in my high school or the next high school. That's how I started.
Any dating advice? No.
No, that I don't think I'm, I'm very lucky that Miri agreed to marry me, but that's, pure luck over there. So, I started writing at a very young age, and I think it's just important to write. I mean, if you like this kind of work, you just have to write all the time. Whether it gets published or not doesn't really matter in the long run.
Yeah.
But just, and by the way, writing the book, for example, I would get up every morning at 4 a.m. And I had this rule of don't get up from the chair unless you have to go to the bathroom until 6:45 a.m. when I would wake up the girls for, it just,
I have that scheduled too.
Yeah. That's the best advice I can give. Just write.
Yeah. That just right. So thank you for taking some edge off the Middle East. It really has been a joy to see you again, my friend. I will see you next year in Jerusalem, and next year in Israel. In Nahal Oz. Yeah.
Amen.
That's all the time we have for this week. Again, thank you for our listeners for tuning in, and our colleagues for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MAI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We'll see you all soon.